Well, I'm joined now by our correspondent Secunda Kamani, who joins us from Kabul. Secunda, worrying developments. You know people who are heading to the airport. I know people who are heading to that airport to get out, and this was talked about by Western intelligence agencies in the last 24 hours, and now this.
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to make contact with a number of people that we've been in touch with who are in and around the airport to check that they're safe and to try and find out more details. At the moment, they haven't come yet, but what we do know, or what we're being told, is that a suicide bomber blew himself up close to the Abbey Gate entrance to the airport. That's an entrance where there's a presence of British soldiers and American soldiers. I've been there, I've filmed there on a number of occasions. There's large crowds of ordinary Afghans trying to get through, many of them without correct documentation, so thousands of people there, as well as smaller numbers of people who did have the correct documentation who were further along, closer to the gate. We're not clear exactly where this explosion happened, but also getting reports of ongoing gunfire. This is very much a fluid situation. This is very much what everyone was afraid of happening. As you say, a number of Western security agencies had warned of the possibility of a suicide attack, saying that it was imminent, saying that it was just a number of hours away potentially. That message not really filtering through to those people in such a state of confusion, in such a state of desperation at the airport. Now we've had this blast.
Yeah, and casualties remain unclear. We're still waiting for that information to come through. But Secunda, Bilal Sawari was just saying now, you know, one of the things that we need to look at is the security that was provided at the airport. Just help our viewers understand that road to the airport, the number of checkpoints, who held the security of the airport, and how this could have slipped through. I mean, frankly, there is so much chaos at that airport that you know, so much has happened there. But just help us understand the makeup of the airport.
It's confusing because there's a number of different gates and there's multiple different forces in charge of different parts of the areas around the airport. So you have the Taliban, you have American and British forces, as well as other kind of NATO nations at some of the gates right by the entrances, really. And you also have units of Afghan army forces that are yet to surrender, that are kind of working alongside American forces. So you have multiple different forces in charge of different parts, sometimes quite close to each other. Now, we've seen lots of reports of Taliban checkpoints leading up to the airport. I have to say, in all the trips that I've done to the airport, I've only seen, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen an active Taliban checkpoint, as one would describe it, where people are being searched systematically and asked who they are and where they're going and what their documentation is. I've heard colleagues talking about it, but all the approaches to the airport that I've taken, there's not been that. We've seen Taliban forces at times, but not checking and stopping people, certainly not on a regular basis. So, you know, this was a soft target. If someone wanted to carry out an awful suicide bombing, one can hardly fathom the rationale or justification for it, given that there's so many ordinary desperate Afghans there. But if someone wanted to do it, it would have been an easy target to strike.
Very much so, and not just the people who have camped out there for days and days, busloads of people who have been promised some kind of safe passage, some kind of security by various different governments who are trying to evacuate their staff and their people. And just in the last few hours, we were told that people should stay away from the airport. But ultimately, I imagine the bulk of the casualties will be the Afghans themselves.
Absolutely, and tragically that seems always to be the case. Ordinary Afghans paying the price for a conflict that they have no part in and certainly have no desire to be part of. The suspicion will be, of course, that this attack was carried out by the Islamic State group. No claim of responsibility yet, but they've repeatedly carried out horrific, devastating attacks on the softest of targets. They've carried out attacks on wedding halls, on hospital maternity units. It's on almost anything you can think of, they've attacked. So, and we heard these repeated warnings that an attack was possible, was likely, and was imminent. Unfortunately, that message would not have filtered down to the people on the ground, and many of those people too desperate to try and leave the country to have really given up their intention to try and get inside just because of this threat. So those people would have most likely make up the bulk of the casualties. Although, as you say, as of yet, we still don't have those figures.
We are still getting information on that. Secunda, if I can keep you there for a minute and just bring in Frank Gardner to give us some perspective on ISIS-K, really, and who they are, their foothold in Afghanistan, and what all this means.
Well, the warning was very much about the so-called ISIS-K, otherwise known as Islamic State in Khorasan province, which is the affiliate of ISIS, based in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. Last year, they carried out 24 attacks in Kabul alone, 18 in the year before that. And as Secunda was mentioning there, they are absolutely ruthless in who they target. They have gone into maternity wards of a hospital and shot dead pregnant women and babies. They have targeted girls' schools. They have absolutely no morality whatsoever, and they are considered to be the biggest security threat right now. They haven't managed to recruit that many ISIS militants from Syria and Iraq. They'd like to, but it's actually geographically quite difficult for them to do. So they've recruited from disaffected Taliban in the past, Taliban fighters who don't consider that the Taliban are extreme enough. They've also recruited from Pakistani Taliban, and they have been involved in the drugs trade.
You know, Frank, we were just talking to Bilal Sarwari, who said this latest explosion sums up the failures of this withdrawal of the last 20 years, of the fact that an airport couldn't be secured.
Well, I think we're going to have to wait for the exact details, but you've seen the scenes of chaos there. I mean, I think you've got to separate two things. The Western military withdrawal from Afghanistan was a shambles, the way it was announced. It wasn't the fact that they withdrew. They were going to have to end their presence sooner or later. But the fact that it was done overnight practically, well, they withdrew from Bagram Airport overnight, it simply pulled the rug from underneath the fairly weak and unstable Afghan national forces, so they just simply surrendered all over the place. But the airlift has been an incredible success. To have organised such a mass evacuation of people at short notice, in terrible conditions, and working with the compliance of a force that has just been fighting a 20-year insurgency. It's extraordinary that it has gone as well as it has. And I think you've got to pay some credit to the people who are risking their lives down there on that runway, on both sides of the fence. The Taliban have been despite the reports of obstructions and beatings, they have been relatively compliant. They have allowed, as you put it yourself this morning on the broadcast we both did, the cream, the brains of Afghan society to stream out of the country. This is terrible optics for the Taliban. This does not look good for them, and yet they have up until now allowed it.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, they've called on Afghans not to leave the country. And while the focus has been on Kabul airport, there are other border crossings that are flooding with people. And there must be concern, Frank, from intelligence agencies of the number of people who are just moving now. Security threats, security concerns across the region.
Well, yes. I mean, Afghanistan, unfortunately, has suffered mass displacement of populations ever since 1979, since the Soviet invasion on Christmas Eve, with millions displaced. Pakistan has hosted a lot of these people, so any instability in Afghanistan is going to play out into regional countries. Turkey has said, we don't want to be a transit area for them. They're trying to seal their border with Iran. There are crossing points, Spin Boldak, for example, in the southeast of the country on the Afghan-Pakistan border. There is a plan mooted by British government ministers to try and set up regional hubs so that people can, if they can't get out by air, to somehow make their way across the borders. But that's difficult and dangerous and expensive for them. And those countries aren't necessarily going to want them. Turkey certainly said, we don't want them.
Yeah, absolutely. And all sorts of security concerns. And just, Frank, tell us what Western intelligence agencies have been warning in the last 24 hours, because they said something like this was imminent.
They did, and it was met by enormous scepticism on social media and on phone-ins, with so many people, certainly here in Britain, saying, oh, this is just a cover-up. This is just concocted. It's made up to try and cover up for the fact that they've messed up the military withdrawal from Afghanistan and the fact they can't get everybody out. Sadly, it's been proved that it's real. I don't think I ever kind of doubted it myself, because I know that ISIS-K, or Islamic State Khorasan province, have carried out so many devastating attacks in the past.